I'm Richard Dasher. I direct the U.S. Asia Technology Management Center, which you can see right over there. And essentially, the US ATMC is really the sponsor of this series. All of the funds that go into this, except for the university infrastructure, is really from us. I'm not paid by Stanford for teaching this. And we've done these now for 32 years with this kind of format where we have hybrid audiences, mixed audiences of students and people from Silicon Valley. And we're really delighted to welcome all of you. I also want to say a special thanks to the 19 member companies of the US Asia Technology Management Center, because that's whose money we use to put on this series. They are supporting this activity along with research and other kinds of programs. So let's get into today's topic. Today, I want to talk about the whole concept of how manufacturing and supply chains taken together as one system are going through a kind of period of realignment. First of all, for those of you who are students who are taking this for university credit, you'll need to register. You have your choice, either the electrical engineering number or the East Asian CEAS number or the EALC number. It's a 1-unit course, pass, no credit. Please do take a look at the syllabus, because there are other seminars kind of like this at Stanford, and every single one of them has a different set of requirements to get credit. Ours is, first, send me a weekly comment, one comment for each session within 2 weeks of the time of the session, to kind of prove to me that you watched it. It doesn't have to be very long. 60 words, 70 words is fine. It's just something that you got from the session by watching the session. The second requirement that we have is in-person attendance every time we are here in person. Due to auditorium availability, some weeks we're going to have to be Zoom only. We will make sure to announce that and be sure to check each week and also for the week before. If you're a student, you can take one excused absence, no questions asked. If it looks like you're not going to be able to be here in person more than one time, send me an email, preferably before this happens, and I'll talk to you. If it's a requirement for Stanford, like you're on the sports team, or you're taking a required class that meets at the same time as this one, it happens, I may be able to waive the requirement for you. Otherwise, I'll give you a simple makeup assignment in place of the in-person attendance requirement. Do note that the official class time is 4:30 to 5:50, and we'll adhere to that pretty carefully. So please be here for the whole session. But we're delighted that the public is here. Everybody, please note that we're recording this session, and the video of this session will go to the internet on our YouTube channel. So for those of you who are watching by Zoom, I doubt if your pictures will be on, but you can always shut your camera off if you want to. But if it's a Zoom only session and you're a student, we need the registration. We'll get the information from Zoom about who is watching, and that's how we will credit your attendance for those sessions. Otherwise, be sure to meet Sarah, because Sarah has a sign-up sheet. And today what she has is an incoming survey that we'd like to ask everybody to fill out, not only students, but people who are visiting, so we can find out what you're interested in, as well as who you are and how you found out about us. Any kind of requests, any kind of things where you need an accommodation, any kind of inquiry about this, I'm one email away. So please feel free to ask me whatever you need to ask. Any questions about this before we move on? Okay, so today I want to introduce kind of supply chains and value chains, how they've been globalizing, the impact of COVID-19, and then most of what we'll talk about today is realignments of supply chains after 2020. Basically, there are new goals for innovation in manufacturing in addition to increasing efficiency or making quality improvement to add value to product and thereby increase profit. So we'll end up by looking ahead to some of the other sessions in the series too. A supply chain, really look at the black letters, right? Materials, component systems, manufacturing and assembly, distribution, retail, and then the buyer. It's the flow of things from top left to bottom right that people are usually thinking about when they talk about a supply chain. Someone had the really good idea to look at what the final buyer pays and say that how you distribute the costs and profits at every step of the supply chain all the way upstream is a value chain. And this is a very simple kind of view of a supply chain. Most of them are more complicated. Some components have their own very complex supply chains. So this is the semiconductor supply chain. And what they have is over on the left, you see the whole kind of design process. Design in semiconductors involves design software, EDA software that you use in order to design a chip, plus the actual design of the chips. So ARM is a company that provides chip design, right? They don't fabricate a whole chip. Their design is part of a bigger chip. Fabrication, something that has to happen in order to have a semiconductor, and that involves both the materials and it also involves the manufacturing equipment to make the complicated process by which you make a semiconductor. Then once you have something made in the factory, you have to assemble it and test it, package it. You have to then put it into some sort of a final product. Semiconductor is not worth anything unless it's in the middle of a computer server or a cell phone or a car or whatever. So this is kind of an example of a component supply chain. And when you look at this in context, there are so many different stakeholders who are associated with supply chains. This is a simple view of the supply chain for the garment industry, starting with raw materials, and then somewhere there's a factory in here that's making yarn and fabric out of the raw materials. Then you have the factory that cuts it and shapes it into clothing. The agent looks to me like the agent is a representative of the factory owner, I suppose, talking to the distribution and retail downstream. But you also have labor unions that are involved. You've got at-home workers who are involved. If you look at all the people who are involved with supply chains, no wonder manufacturing is such a big. Now, in the world's 5 biggest economies, China, Japan, Germany, India, and the US, there has been a steady decline in the percentage of the economy that comes from manufacturing. This is natural. It's part of economic development because you can standardize a lot of the aspects of manufacturing. And if you can standardize it, it will go to someplace cheaper. That means that in place of manufacturing, you're getting more value added to the economy from the service sector. But still, within this, notice that almost 30%, about 27% of China's economy comes from manufacturing. About 20% of the economy of Japan comes from manufacturing, a little less, 18% of the economy of Germany, about 12 or 13% of the economy of India, and somewhere around 11% of the economy of the US comes from manufacturing. This is, I just had to put in because if you're considering the absolute value, look how much more manufacturing has contributed to the Chinese economy in recent years, since the year 2005. The overall share of the economy is going down, but that means that the growth rate in the Chinese economy is through the roof, right? almost $5 trillion of the Chinese economy is coming from manufacturing. The amount has been going up in these other countries too. One reason is because of advances in manufacturing, more smart manufacturing, the ability to produce products that are not so easy to make in other places. But remember that manufacturing and the rest of the supply chain is a cost. Everything that goes into the supply chain is really something that comes upstream. It's moving upstream from the final price that some buyer has paid. That means that a major goal of innovation of manufacturing technologies and supply chain management, supply chain technologies has been increasing efficiency, lowering cost, and also making it, better quality and so forth, increasing the value of the final product, but at the smallest cost possible. So, as an example, an Apple iPhone, the iPhone 15 is somewhere between $1,000 and $1,500, and the average cost is about $550. Depends on what kind of chips are in it, depends on what kind of other features it has. The Samsung Galaxy S21 is about $1,050 cost, is about $1,050 price, and the cost is $508 or so. Interesting thing about this particular supply chain, the real power in the smartphone supply chain is in the chips. And I would say that because it used to be Apple outsourced all of their processor chips to Intel. Now they've started making them in-house. You make in-house what you think is the real critical core competitive part of the whole system. And then you outsource the rest of it to people who will do a good job for you and make things exactly to the specifications you tell them to make them to. So, in contrast to the chips, the final assembly of the outsource has been, the final assembly of the smartphone has been outsourced. Foxconn is the biggest supplier of Apple, although now Apple is making 25% of its iPhones in India. And notice that, the average worker in a Foxconn factory who's working on an iPhone is only getting about $10 an hour. So you have lots of profit at the end and intense competition upstream between different providers and people whose technology has to be absolutely what Apple wants, but at the absolute minimum cost. So that means that you've had interesting things as the whole world has developed in the last 30 years. Two big things that have happened in supply chain. First is what is usually called disaggregation. At the beginning of a product cycle, one company will do everything. Maybe they'll buy the materials or buy some processed materials, but they will have the entire supply chain in-house. And then as the company grows, as the technology standardizes, typically they focus on what they see as the most competitive core parts of the supply chain, like Apple and the chips, right? And they outsource the other parts. That's disaggregation. This is a natural thing. In the chip industry, you actually have two different industries that grew up as a result of this. One is the fabless companies that basically outsource all their manufacturing. They don't have a factory where they could make chips. And they create their core value from the unique design of their specific chips. And then you have the companies that do manufacturing that may make or keep manufacturing processes into one of their core business strengths to the point that they manufacture other people's designs. If they're doing both design and manufacturing, that's the old integrated device model. Intel is arguably still an integrated device model, although they're outsourcing quite a bit of their manufacturing. So you've got the whole kind of bifurcation. That's the first big thing that's happened as technologies have developed over the last 30 years. The other thing that's happened is globalization. We've had a wonderful time in the history of the world where international travel is safe, it's cheap, it's fast, and we now have a digitally interconnected world where you can transfer entire designs from one designer in Europe to a designer in North America to a designer in Asia and get 24 hours a day work on design, provided they know how to talk to each other. But in any case, now that we've got cloud computing in this digitally interconnected world, most supply chains have globalized, and companies will optimize the geographic location of each node in their supply chain, one on the basis of cost, but just as important on the basis of labor skills. How good is the company? Are they really good at making the product, the component that we want them to make? So if you look at this, this was the picture of the semiconductor a couple of slides ago, the semiconductor supply chain. The semiconductor market worldwide is about 555 billion in 2021. That's really what people get, the price that they sell at this point, but it includes all of the costs upstream. So, the revenue to the US chip firm has to cover their cost of manufacturing and their design costs, no matter whether they outsource it or whether they do it in-house. When you look at the kind of specific elements of the semiconductor supply chain, the design element, this is really companies that are making their money from design. So either the software companies that do design tools or the companies that are selling their IP, right, their designs like ARM. The interesting thing about these two charts, the previous page and this one, the market share of the world market is almost exactly the same. The only differences are in Japan and in rest of world, which is really Europe. In Japan, there's less percentage of the world market for design is achieved there, probably because more of the Japanese designing is done in-house for the Japanese chip companies. And I would say that, you have more design in Europe, which is an indication that you've got more independent design firms or EDA companies that are enabling other companies to do design. Very different picture when you go further upstream and look at the materials. This is the materials and the chemicals that go into computer chips. Remember from a few slides ago, the US share of the world market for materials was 43%. But I'm sorry, the US share of the semiconductor market was 43%. But the share of the US of the materials market is only 13%. Taiwan had 8% of the semiconductor market, but 25.4% of the materials market. China has 7% of the world semiconductor market revenue, but 14.8% of the materials. You can see it's kind of small. But in any case, there are a few places where you really have star performers. Photomasks, the masks that you have to put down in lithographic equipment to make the design, on the silicon that you can etch out, is 49% of those photomasks are coming from Taiwan. And silicon on insulator, which is not just a silicon wafer, not just a substrate on silicon, but silicon and then insulator, then silicon, then insulator kind of substrates. Rest of the world has 35% of that. Those are kind of noticeable in these in this chart. So already you see lopsided who's doing what in the industry. When you look at the semiconductor manufacturing equipment, the US has a slightly smaller share of the world market than it does of the semiconductors themselves. But the people who've really gone up is Japan and also rest of world. Japan has 30% of the semiconductor manufacturing equipment world market. Notice that you almost don't have any of that made in Taiwan, and only a little bit made in China, and a relatively quite small percentage of the world market semiconductor manufacturing equipment coming from South Korea. So this is a very interesting thing, and this kind of different shares of these different component markets of the semiconductor supply chain, sure enough, stands on top of massive world flow. So 90% of the US and Japan semiconductor manufacturing equipment sales are going into the Indo-Pacific. China is the biggest single market for semiconductor manufacturing equipment. 30% of the US machines are going to China, 20% of the Japanese machines are going to China, and 30% of the ROK, the South Korean machines are also going to China. Almost all of China's semiconductor manufacturing equipment and most of Korea's semiconductor manufacturing equipment are going to stay at home for domestic companies. So this is the kind of thing that's going on, and this leads to diagrams that are pretty easy to find on the internet. If you look at how a smartphone processor chip is made, the design may come from the US or it may come based on IP, specific designs from Europe. Remember, I mentioned ARM. The materials, silicon is, a lot of it is mined in the United States. That's at the very low end of the scale. But then you have to grow the ingots of pure silicon. A lot of that is processed into wafers in Japan and in South Korea. The manufacturing equipment will come largely from the US, Japan, and Europe. And then the manufacturing is going to be done in Southeast Asia or mainland China. And what had happened until about 15 years ago is that the end markets for these things were all US, Europe, and Japan. Now the end market in China is big. The end market in Southeast Asia is growing very rapidly. The end market in India is growing quite rapidly. And you also have the kickback. So there's always been arguments against global supply chains because, first of all, the flow of manufacturing jobs to places outside your home country is something politicians don't like. They've never liked it. It's especially bad when the economy is a little bit bad. And one reason is because manufacturing jobs, whether it's automobile industry or semiconductor industry or whatever, are quite highly paid, and they don't really require that much advanced education. You could get high school workers in a car factory in Detroit who, workers with a high school education in Detroit would be making $80 an hour years ago. So it's hard to find jobs with that kind of economic benefits for people if they lose their manufacturing jobs. Also, well before the COVID pandemic, there was concern in the US that outsourcing was funding China's rise as a competitor that was not really interested in maintaining good relationships with the US. Especially a big shock was the Made in China 2025 policy statement that was announced in 2015. That really shocked a lot of people, seeing that China was not just going to outsource things for other people, but was going to lead the world in the technologies. There's also been some concern about the relationship between global supply chains and environmental impact. Of course, if you're shipping products, even if they're small like semiconductor chips, all over the world before they finally wind up in a smartphone, you're generating more CO2 than if you can all make it in one geographic location. So interestingly enough, the United Nations SDGs has a specific SDG that talks about resilient infrastructure, inclusive and sustainable industrialization and innovation. And then COVID hit. COVID had a huge impact on this whole system. On the supply side, you couldn't get access to things, including some things that there was a sudden increase in demand, like drugs and medicine, or remember how hard it was to get masks during the pandemic? So the masks were being made in other places and it was hard to get them here. So this would have been bad enough, but it lasted longer than people expected. It was completely worldwide. You know, over 210 countries and territories were basically shut down during the pandemic. And almost all of the industries that were relying on this wonderful global system that we had, enabled by transportation and the internet, were affected. So it was a much bigger impact than people expected. This was a catalyst that made everybody aware of the need to pay attention to other things in addition to the economics of the supply chain. So there are really four areas that I think supply chains are becoming oriented toward now. Resilience is the first. Resilience is kind of a tough one to talk about because everything has to do with resilience, right? Resilience against natural disaster, resilience against, you know, foreign powers, whatever. But I think if we kind of look at it as expected or unexpected external factors like natural disasters, that's pretty good. National security and independence, the reshoring movement, bring up manufacturing back to America, that's a great reorientation that has economic consequences. American workers will not be happy earning $10 an hour to make an iPhone. So you're not going to have the same low cost in American manufacturing that you will in other places. Environmental sustainability is a major goal for manufacturing and supply chains now. And the other one is just keeping up with the sudden disruptions that come from the incredibly rapid pace of technology change in the middle of an industrial revolution. This is what I want to look a little bit more at in our talk today. Notice that they are often all lumped together as resilience, but you're really looking at four kind of different motivations. So if we're looking at things that cause supply chain disruption, you've got natural disasters, and okay, thanks to climate change, we have a few more of those, and they're more severe than they used to be. You've got the geopolitical issues, the whole thing about possible shutdowns, but you know, somebody says they're going to charge 100% tariff on your good. That is something that you need to be resilient in your whole product pipeline. You've got other kinds of things that often are not lumped in with the kind of COVID type resilience, but cybersecurity, data breaches, that kind of thing. Also, union activities. Somebody goes on strike, what happens to the things that were supposed to be put onto the ship? Same thing with social unrest. And then you have things that you always have to be ready for something you didn't expect at all. There are two main solutions that are being used right now to deal with the resiliency problem. One is increasing redundancy, have a more diverse supply chain with more factories and more shippers and supplies, and also new IT solutions. You're seeing this under the name of smart manufacturing a lot. You're seeing some things on supply chain data integration. Interestingly enough, after COVID, the total number of exports from China and from Southeast Asia was much greater than it was before. The growth in exports was much greater than it was before the pandemic. 6.6% China export growth, 7.1% Southeast Asia export growth between the years 2019 and 2023. So that includes the pandemic. The highest export growth is in kind of the major manufacturing locations inside Southeast Asia, specifically Indonesia, Vietnam, and Malaysia. Indonesia is still doing a lot with commodities and metals, but they also have a growing, range of more downstream industries from the materials. Vietnam is driven by a lot of foreign direct investment by companies outside Vietnam in factories for making things like electronics. We'll look at that in a little bit more detail. Malaysia has been a very important hub in really coming up in the automotive space as well, especially along with the shift to EVs. So that's the redundancy side. Because people are not shutting down one factory when they build a new one, they're increasing the number of factories. That means that there's more exports going on. That's why I put in the export. The IT solutions, first of all, the architecture of a company's IT and its manufacturing and supply chain is going to be more modular and easy to scale up as well as easy to scale down. You'll be able to isolate problem locations and move on around them easier. Predictive analytics has ways of helping out with your resilience because you're able to do a lot of what if planning. And the integration of manufacturing and supply chain is coming in a number of different areas. Mostly these things are smart manufacturing. What you're not seeing much yet is the integration of factory control software with business IT, point of sale data, that kind of thing. You could determine which factory is going to make how much stuff based on predictions that you make from your business data, point of sale. Why doesn't this happen automatically? One, companies keep their factory control software offline. Most of that's not connected to the internet. Second, the companies are kind of, how can I say this? It's a power play. Who's going to be in charge of that system? The person in charge of the factory or the person in charge of business development? And so the kind of structure of companies does not lend itself to that integration. Cybersecurity software is also an important way to increase your resilience. So all of these areas, companies are not being asked to give up profit. What they're being told by the software companies is that they'll still get lots of value from the software they buy, but everybody's advertising using resilience now. It's fascinating. So Snowflake, build resilience in your manufacturing supply chain. IBM, apply the power of AI and the speed of automation to improve supply chain management, resiliency, and sustainability. Hitachi, be prepared. Resiliency starts with digital technology. SAP, integrated business planning, a sustainable risk resilient supply chain demands connected processes. So it's definitely great in the advertising world. I don't mean to be too snarky about that because people really are trying. And resilience is something that companies are paying real money for because they're worried. It's like buying insurance. If you don't buy insurance or, a better security system for your house, you can't really complain too much if somebody breaks in. The second big area, though, is national security. So this is all the stuff about reshoring, or friend shoring is one that it sounds a little bit better. Right now, it's really driven by US-China friction, decoupling. decoupling started considerably before COVID. It's a result of actions on both sides, both the US side and the China side. But the pandemic actually shut down the flow. Suddenly, people saw that all this worry about foreign supply was not just theoretical, it actually shut down. There were real shortages. And there's this concern about relying on a competitor nation. And there's also this whole kind of political thing about, companies should locate their operations to maximize the benefits to their home country. Interesting dynamics there, because if you're running your own company and you own it yourself, you can put your manufacturing wherever you want to. And I know successful American company presidents who own their own company up to about $50–100 million a year in sales, and they keep all of their manufacturing in the US just because they want their customers to buy American. If you work for a public company, or you have investors in your company who are pushing you for more efficiency, who are pushing you for increasing the profit to the people who own the stock in the company, it's very hard to keep everything in the US. It's much better to use cheap transportation and move things around. You're also seeing this kind of thing in other areas besides manufacturing and supply chains. This whole thing about sovereign AI with the characteristics that match the national culture as well as the national legal framework. So this is a big factor now in supply chains. Notice how government is really driving it. This is a copy of Biden's executive order on America's supply chains. Very first thing, policy. The US needs resilient, diverse, and secure supply chains. Okay, so government has two big tools, the carrot and the stick. The carrot is incentives. So the CHIPS Act, $50-something billion to bring chip manufacturing back into the United States. Regulations are more on the other side. You will bring it back. There are a number of laws in the US that require traceability in supply chains that has been very difficult to do. How do you know where the silicon was first taken out of the ground if you're making a computer chip? So, these are some specific legislations that says you have to not only know, but you have to report it. I found some companies that now can provide guarantees of the provenance of all of your materials in a supply chain. This was one of the biggest headaches that one of my contacts in Taiwan mentioned to me in continuing to do business with the US, is that suddenly the reporting requirements for where everything was made, every step upstream in the supply chain, was a real burden. It cost the company money in order to provide that information. Right now, though, what's happening with the decoupling? First of all, investments into China from outside China have dropped. So you may know some of the big venture capital firms that split their China operations and their non-China operations. Sequoia is one. And what's left in China is now working almost exclusively domestically in China. The amount of foreign direct investment, this is when you buy typically more than 10% of a company, so you have some management control over the company. Foreign direct investment into China for new manufacturing, greenfield manufacturing, was down by 17% in the 4 years between 2019 and 23. And in Southeast Asia, it was up by 20%. What does that mean? Europeans, Americans, Japanese who are putting in new companies in emerging Asia are voting on Southeast Asia. They're starting to vote on India, but it's not even showing up in the statistics yet. A lot of this was called China Plus One. Keep your factory in China. The China cell phone market, smartphone market is booming. You know, the China solar cell market is booming. If you have operations in China, don't leave, don't shut them down, although some of that's happening, but build your new fab somewhere else. Intel announced $7 billion to build a chip fab in Malaysia, just I think it was 2022. Interestingly enough, there are many supply chains that you do not notice this decoupling in. You see it in advanced manufacturing, you see it in high-tech stuff. You don't see it too much in apparel. You don't see it too much in, you know, basics. A lot of food processing. I was trying to find the numbers. I heard a presentation a year ago that was just fascinating. It was on the global supply chain. The person started with a jar of Skippy peanut butter and started talking about how many 10,000s of miles, because the Skippy peanut butter sold in the United States, most of those peanuts actually come from China. And, you know, then the glass has to be made somewhere and it has to be formed into a bottle somewhere and you've got to seal it somewhere. So a lot of this is only hitting kind of the advanced manufacturing areas. China Plus One is really popular in China too. This is Chinese outbound foreign direct investment. Chinese companies buying new factory or building factories or buying factories in foreign countries, especially Southeast Asia. In the year 2023, they spent $24 billion of money in foreign direct investment into Southeast Asia. For example, Thailand, which is strong in the automotive industry, is getting just company after company from China setting up operations to make electric vehicles. So Great Wall Motors in 2022 bought the GM factory and said they were going to produce EVs. BYD, which of course is a very big company in China, announced that they were going to build 150,000 EV passenger cars in Thailand every year, some of which they would ship to Europe. They can't ship them to the US, right? We are that much decoupled. The electric car maker Hozon announced their first overseas manufacturing plant in Thailand that we're going to export broadly to Southeast Asia. Chang'an Automotive targeted 100,000 vehicles a year of electric vehicles to export to right-hand drive markets. Australia, New Zealand, UK, that kind of place. So, you know, this is a huge amount of stimulus into the Thai economy in an area that was kind of languishing a little bit. So, you know, the Chinese have been doing China Plus One as well. The third big factor that is going on is concern about environmental sustainability. I have to say that this is kind of driven by government too. From the time of the UN Paris Agreement, the original agreement told companies that they would have to report their emissions, how much greenhouse gases their operations emit from the year 2024. There's the things that a company does in-house that, you know, directly emit carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. Scope 2 is the greenhouse gases that are emitted from the energy that you buy from the power company or from the gasoline makers or whoever. And scope 3 is all of the emissions generated by anybody in your supply chain. The idea is that you're going to have to report all of that. Most companies still do not even know how to model their scope 3 emissions from their supply chain, because you need a lot of data from independent companies you're buying from in your supply chain, and they may not want to give you all their data. And even if they do, how can you verify it? So the current status with this is that in the EU, large firms are going to have to report scope 1 and 2 by 2026, and scope 3 by 2027. And then a couple of sentences later, it says, you must have reasonable assurance in the numbers that you report by the year 2030. So you got to report, and then you make sure that your report is accurate. The US Securities and Exchange Commission only mandated scope 1 and 2 this year. They did not mandate scope 3. But if you want an international reputation or you do business internationally, it's going to be just like the GDPR with data privacy. You'll follow the European standards. So Stanford has a website where Stanford gives you its model of its scope 1 emissions, and its scope 2 emissions, and its scope 3 emissions, which include things like student travel, employee travel, fuel and energy related activities, waste, employee commuting. So if Stanford could convince me to commute by bicycle, I would help their scope 3 emissions a little bit. Now, scope 3 is by far the biggest kind of emissions in any company's footprint. All purchased goods and services at Stanford is a huge factor. This is the scope 1 and 2, right? Peak time and current use of emissions generation. The scope 3 emissions for a company are estimated to be 11.4 times greater than its direct emissions from scope 1. So this is a big deal. Another hot topic in the sustainability area that's really come out in the last couple of years, and you're seeing it on the news a lot this week, are forever chemicals. PFAS, which is per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. I did say that. And you see that there's been a lot of US government legislation recently to, first of all, the carrot. $2 billion from the bipartisan infrastructure law went to address PFAS in drinking water. And then you get the kind of regulations. Companies are now required to report the uses, production volumes, disposal, exposure, and hazards of any PFAS in their operations. They have guidance on destruction and disposal. The government also, in their own procurement, has said that they will not allow any PFAS to be in the cleaning chemicals that contractors use to clean up government buildings. And finally, the government established a drinking water standard for PFAS just a few months ago. It's all over. One of the laws is about 329 PFAS materials that are not being actively used now, but they are around. And companies will have to report any intent to make or use those chemicals in the future. So there's a huge database of what these things are. Government's driving a lot of this. Government has the carrot, it has the stick. The other thing that government does is it makes or it recognizes standards. In the EU, governments actually negotiate standards more. In the US, we tend to let companies negotiate the standards, but the government will recognize it. The National Institute of Standards and Technology in the US is all about how do you measure things. And the government also does international kind of negotiations to try to harmonize these frameworks. And the final thing that the government needs to do to have this kind of more rich goals for manufacturing and supply chain is to raise public awareness. But it's industry that actually has to deliver the innovations that will solve the problems. Governments don't sell that much in an economy like the US. I mean, if you talk about SOEs in China, yes. But essentially, this is a positive kind of thing because anything that a company puts out will have no value if somebody doesn't want to use it. So anything that the company delivers, the innovations they deliver, must meet conditions of economic feasibility. They must be attractive to the market. Universities also participate in this, but they're upstream of the companies. I don't know any American universities that have factories that actually make products, but they will license technologies to the companies, and the companies will make the products. And then the last set that has to happen is the public. The public has to, you've got to have buyers for all these solutions that industry is providing. And the other thing that the public sector does in a place like the United States is it has the media who really represent the public and holding everybody accountable. If the only information you got about supply chain emissions was from the company side, yeah, I'm not sure how much I believe it either. So these are kind of the sector roles in this realignment. The fourth thing is just dealing with disruption. We're in the middle of the third and fourth industrial revolutions right now. The first industrial revolution was mechanization. The second one was new ways to use machines. The third industrial revolution was really the advent of digital technology, the spread of digital technology everywhere. And the fourth industrial revolution is using new tools and new ways to get value from that digital technology. So you'll see this a lot. The third industrial revolution, the amount of data generated each year is just huge. A self-driving car generates over 1 terabyte of data from 4 hours of use. So a lot of it is not saved. A lot of it never has to go into the data centers, but it's going to be used. AI is a good example of how far the fourth industrial revolution has gone. This was in January of 2021. Industrial manufacturing firms, the executives of those firms, 150 executives were polled. 93% of them said that their company was already using artificial intelligence. So ChatGPT was only the most recent development, right? This means that lives are changing. This is why it's called an industrial revolution. I think somewhere in the depths of my closet, I still have an old simple camera, but I haven't taken a picture with anything other than a cell phone for years. Banks are going into online. Newspapers, I really feel kind of sorry for newspapers and magazines because all the advertising is going online. And really, the shift to electric cars is a great example of a major disruption in the supply chain. I was giving a presentation to German companies in Stuttgart who are in the automotive supply chain area. And one of the companies made fuel injection. So guess what? If the world goes to electric vehicles, you don't need fuel injection. So what are they going to do? One year when I asked the question, the person said, we'll be making the fuel injector for the last gas-powered car on Earth. And, within a year or two, they're all saying, oh, we're looking at new electric vehicle components. So, yeah, this requires resilience. All the stuff about digital transformation is really industry's response to the fourth industrial revolution. And so you're seeing these kinds of things going on in manufacturing and supply chains. More modular IT architecture. You're seeing more focus on small batch, more customized products. A lot of the small batch now is helping the geographic diversity increase. So smaller, more distributed factories. You're seeing more automated delivery services because they are generate less emissions, they're more efficient. And you are seeing some integration of factory software, and you're also seeing more contingency planning. What do we do when the next hurricane comes by? What do we do when the next earthquake comes? I think the planning for the entire supply chain, not just an individual installation, has definitely improved. But there are limits. This is business. Supply chains and manufacturing are a business institution, right? And so that means that the basic goals of increasing efficiency, lowering costs, and improving quality, raising profit, are always going to be dominant. You will not be able to sell something that departs from that very much. I see on the sustainability side too many presentations where they expect people to have lifestyles that I don't think a business person would invest in because people don't show that they like that kind of thing. Ultimately, how much, if you're increasing redundancy, if you're adding new IT solutions, you're increasing your costs. How much will the market bear? Will a value chain bear in order to reach these new goals? Reshoring goals can also have negative economic consequences. If you do take all of your manufacturing inside the country, your business may be isolated from other things that happen elsewhere in the world. That's happened a number of times with things like high definition television in Japan. In the 1980s, Japan came out with a wonderful domestic standard for high definition television. The only problem was it was analog. And the rest of the world went to digital TV. It took Japan another 15 years before they changed over to accept digital standards in the broadcast. So, you know, that kind of thing, isolation is danger. And how long before you forget COVID? You know, especially activist investors who want to maximize the profit so that the stock price goes up. How long are they going to be willing to invest in supply chains that may be a little bit richer than you need on a day-to-day basis, but they are great in times of emergency? So I think that's a challenge. This is what we've talked about. COVID-19 had a big impact, but it wasn't the beginning, especially for geopolitical tension and environmental awareness. That started a number of years before. The 4 areas that manufacturing and supply chains are really treating as new goals of innovation are the resilience, the national security and independence, environmental sustainability, and keeping up with the disruptive innovations of the current industrial revolutions. Realignment is fundamentally an innovation problem, and that's where we go from here. Some of our sessions are going to focus on specific innovations. Like next week, we've got a panel of 3 startup companies that have really interesting new approaches to design for manufacturing. I think you'll find these fun. 2 weeks from now, we have a speaker from South Korea. The Electronics Technology Research Institute has a new semiconductor and micro LED kind of much more efficient kind of technology that they're commercializing. We have a couple of big company presentations in this area that we're looking at later in the series. And we have some sessions in this series that will really be about case studies of the whole picture. So establishing a semiconductor industry in India. If the semiconductor industry is going to realign itself geographically, then India is a very important consideration. Note, please, once again, watch out. Some of our sessions we'll have here in the auditorium. Other sessions have to be Zoom only due to auditorium availability or speaker availability. So watch every week to make sure where we're meeting. And that's really what I wanted to present today. I'd be very happy to try to address some of your questions. Let me stop my slideshow.
Has there been any attempts to invest in Latin American or African countries to sort of, you know, broaden the geographic development?
There have been, and Latin America is a very interesting, diverse set of different countries that have different sort of strengths. You've got places like Brazil that have so much natural resources. It's really hard to get away from making money just by sending off your natural resources. Although they're doing a lot of innovation, there's a lot of investment into Latin America. It's not taking on the kind of function of factory of the world yet. And I'm really seeing that trend in Southeast Asia. So, of course it's happening. You would want to have that much geographic diversity, especially if you're selling into some of the very large markets in South America or in Mexico, right? You want to have your manufacturing not too far away from your market. That's always been kind of a business sort of understood thing. So that tends to be where you put things. Go ahead, Paul.
There are a couple of companies that seem to be integrating vertically. I'm thinking about Tesla.
Yeah.
Seeing manufacturing as a competitive strategic advantage.
Right.
And also about Boeing that had so many problems created by outsiders.
Yeah.
Are they, in your opinion, just two random examples, or are we going to witness some more companies trying to leverage vertical integration for competitive advantage?
Companies will vertically integrate when they think that they can maintain competitiveness or make more money that way. And yes, there's always that possibility. Tesla is interesting because the electric car industry really didn't do much until they came along. Nissan had the Nissan Leaf, right? But really, Tesla as a complete do-it-in-house kind of thing was a new industry. It would not surprise me if they start to gradually move things out. Although I do have to say, you remember the old the Roadster, the sports car they started with? The first model of that was designed by Lotus in England, not by Tesla. So it's not like they don't do anything out. Yeah, this is a tendency that it really has to do with whether a part is standard or whether it's something that you need to have really close, intense knowledge exchange between the final assembler and the system provider. The automotive industry, the standard parts providers can't get any profit. If you make brake shoes, you're not going to make much of a profit in the auto industry. But the systems providers, things like sunroofs or the fuel system, those kinds of things require intense close cooperation, and those systems providers are actually very strong. So everybody talks about Toyota and Ford and so forth, but Visteon for Ford is one of their tier one suppliers. Toyota Denso is a major supplier that's actually quite powerful. Although if you talk to the Denso people about innovation, they say we have to wait until Toyota tells us what they want. Yeah, great question. You do see some vertical integration. It's relatively rare. By far the tendency is to standardize something because that's more efficient, standardized parts, right? And as soon as you standardize it, then you can re-optimize where you're going to make it. Thanks. Go ahead.
Where do you see this terror thing going?
Terror?
As far as how it impacts people's decision to move their supply chain, because right now I'm seeing that impacting stuff that is purely political. For example, import something in general now, I would say a significant portion of it would be 25% minimum tariff.
Yeah. You know, that's a perennial problem, and companies try to make the best cost benefit analysis that they can. I mean, terrorism is not just the places you expect it. For a while, there was this thing about Japanese executives being kidnapped in the Philippines. I mean, this was years ago.
Tariffs. T-A-R-I-F-S.
Oh, tariffs. Sorry. Now I got you. Pardon me. Okay, so look, tariffs are a tool by the government that really is not an incentive. It's a stick, right? It's not a carrot. It's not so much of an incentive. It's a disincentive to buy from overseas. And, you know, it's appropriate to use a tariff if you've got dumping going on from a foreign supplier, they're supplying it lower than their own cost, or you have some other kind of reason why you're really, you know, there's something going on in that supply chain that shouldn't be going on. But it is absolutely critical to remember that it's the customers who pay for those tariffs, right? That comes down, floats downstream and is in the final price of what you buy. And so it's the consumers here that really ultimately pay for them. But certainly if you put 100% tariff on Chinese EVs like Canada did just a few months ago or weeks ago, certainly that's going to reduce the sales. Now, that may also cause the domestic producers, not that, you know, may cause your domestic producers to get a little bit monopolistic in their attitudes, right? We have less competition because the other people you've got to pay twice to get something from Apple, right? If you're in another country. So it's one of those things that's there. I think that they're overused. And I think that they don't help resilience at all. They are purely a way to make it more difficult for a foreign supplier to supply into a country. Thanks. Good question. Sorry, I didn't understand what you're saying. Other questions? Why don't you go first? I'm sorry, say that one more time. Yeah.
From the national security perspective.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm just curious, like a two-part question is like, first, if you think the increase of like exports and sort of FDI into Southeast Asian countries as a whole as a result of sort of the decoupling from China. And I guess the second part is if you think decoupling away from China would ever be possible in like high-tech industries, especially given how China controls like a majority of the group.
Well, we lived through a Cold War where there was not a whole lot of exchange back and forth between the Soviet bloc and the Western bloc. We lived through it. I think that decoupling from China, the first thing that happened is that the American companies start to pull back one way or another, right? So they start to put their new factories into Southeast Asia instead of into China. The second thing that happens is the Chinese companies figure that if we're going to expand by going into world markets, we need to have our facilities overseas. So then they start putting things in Southeast Asia. The kind of, you know, I think that there are dangers in decoupling, but it's really a hard problem to deal with. What's wrong with being proud of your country? You know, buy American. And, you know, back in the 1980s, if you worked for an American car company and you bought a Toyota Corolla and drove it, you could not park it in the parking lot. So, okay, the decoupling is kind of where that goes. So people, you know, can feel pride in their country, but if the pride in your country becomes negative for every other country, that's not such a good thing. And I think that there are some ways we're not going to be able to have purely domestic supply chains. That is not economically feasible. First of all, they would be very inefficient. Prices would be through the roof. Inflation would be crazy here in the US. But the other thing is you're leaving the possibility of efficiency on the table and not taking advantage of it. Not only in terms of where you put your factory, but where do you get your data for analysis? In these gigantic, models that people are using for AI analysis. Somebody I had speaking in one of these series a couple of years ago was doing a medical image analysis company, and he decided to locate it in China because there's 8 times as much, X-ray data in China as there is here. So to leave efficiency on the table is something that I don't think people will try to do it, but it will have negative impact. So there are limits to decoupling. Good question.
If you can move to the earlier slide where you had the trend chart of top 5 economies.
The GDP.
Yeah, GDP of manufacturing.
Yeah.
Yeah, this slide. So a question for this slide.
Yeah.
How do you see this in the near future when the cost of electricity goes down significantly in certain geographies, with factories becoming like a dark factories? So say in China or other geographies, they are making factories with 0 human needed, like a fully automated, and the cost of electricity going down, say through nuclear plants and other by 70% or 80% by 2030. So
Yeah.
do you see that manufacturing peaking again in those economies, or how?
People are always going to need things made. If the things that are being made don't generate jobs, some jobs, there's nobody who will have the money to buy the things that are made. So you run into kind of a catch-22, right? I do think that, the cost of manufacturing has gone down. The productivity has gone way up. And that still means that manufacturing accounts for less of a share of the economy. There are too many other ways that we create value in modern economies. One of the things that will never change in the world is people will continue to survive by innovating. And that means that there will always be new things. Some of those new things will be physical and will have to be made. And getting things from point A to point B until we have Star Trek, transporters, you're going to have that. So I think that manufacturing will always be there. If there are no people involved in manufacturing, that's an interesting concept. It's kind of still a little bit science fiction-y, but I've seen a factory in Japan that was making 80,000 air compressors for automobiles an hour, and they had 5 people in the factory. So, you see these kind of things, right?
A follow-up on that, say, for example, China's labor cost kept increasing in the last 10 years. And
Right.
Because of that, they also followed China +1 and moved few things to like in
Places where it's cheaper. And okay, so Malaysia is pretty expensive. Vietnam is cheaper. Indonesia is cheaper still. As those labor costs go up, where do you go?
No, so my question was if the number of human needed reduces
Right.
significantly and the cost of electricity goes down, will they bring back to their local?
What we'll mean is the value added in the products will come from other places.
Yeah.
The value added in an automobile arguably is not really in the engine. It's in the IT now already. And so you're going to continue to see shifts of where the value is being created, even in products that we're familiar with. it may reduce the need to go to cheaper places. It may make it easier to keep things domestic. But I think that still you lose in knowledge exchange. And the bigger pool of knowledge you can access, the better. Thanks. Good comment. Maybe one more question if we have it. Go ahead.
Thank you, Bill. And also have a question or confusion about like how real is this kind of shift from China to Southeast Asia,
Yeah.
especially, you know, for a lot of emerging countries. I don't think it's necessarily like a resilience increase. If you shift certain industries from China, like the manufacturers to like Southeast Asia, then you have like the increased resilience because some of the parts are actually still produced in China. Some of the industries are still there, and also in the advanced tech industries, especially this case.
So what we're talking about is how tightly integrated economic growth in China is with the rest of the world. The China economy is still in the middle of a miracle, right? Growing drastically, although the growth rate has really slowed down. That's not a little thing. That's not just because of decoupling, right? Decoupling is a minor thing that's causing the growth rate in China to drop. There are other problems, but look how much bigger the exports from China are than from all Southeast Asia on this slide, right? That's just exports. And the size of the economy is, you know, China has moved up to be arguably the single largest economy in the world if you use the purchase power parity way of measuring GDP. So, you know, the shift of European and Japanese and American and other factories into Southeast Asia instead of being into China, what that could be, it really depends on how much Chinese are shifting into those areas, right? If US and China decoupling are pure competition, the people who will determine who win will be rest of world, neither the US nor China. It will be who has the best relationships in Southeast Asia, who has the best relationships in Latin America, who has the best relationships other places. So I think that, you know, arguably both countries are trying to deal with that situation in a kind of positive way too, right? Not just shift away from each other. So that's great. And these are all really great questions. I look forward to seeing you all again next week. We're in person next week. We are available by Zoom for those of you who are watching from outside the Bay Area. And yeah, thanks very much for coming today.